In traditional history, there are still many unresolved historical and chronological mysteries. One of them is the mystery of the ancient Etruscans. They were a people who appeared in Italy, supposedly in the 8th century BC, even before the foundation of Rome, and created a remarkable culture there. Then they mysteriously disappeared, leaving behind numerous monuments covered with incomprehensible inscriptions that scholars still cannot decipher. Moreover, among historians there is an opinion that Etruscan inscriptions cannot be read. Therefore, the expression, Etruscan is not readable, has become widespread. Until this day, many scholars are convinced that Etruscan texts will never be deciphered under any circumstances, neither in the present nor in the future. But why are they so certain? Perhaps these ancient inscriptions hold some secret that greatly puzzles and even frightens historians. In ancient times, in the territory of the modern Italian province of Tuscany, in central Italy, between the Arno and Tiber rivers, there existed a country called Etruria. The inhabitants of this country were called Etruscans. The authority of this state extended to the south and north of the Arno and Tiber, and to the east, reaching the Adriatic Sea. Traditional history claims that this was in the 1st millennium BC. The Etruscan civilization was highly advanced and had a significant influence on the formation of Roman civilization. In the 14th–16th centuries, it was Etruria that became the cradle of the Renaissance culture. Historians have been studying the Etruscan issue for centuries. However, the world of the Etruscans has never become closer or clearer to them. To this day, Etruscologists cannot solve the two main mysteries of the Etruscans. As historians themselves claim, neither the origin of the Etruscans nor their language has been precisely established. The first mystery is the origin of the Etruscans. There is no conclusive evidence supporting any single theory about the origin of this people. For a long time, 3 versions were the most widespread. One of them is the so-called Eastern theory of the origin of Etruscan civilization. It was based on the authority of the so-called ancient authors, particularly Herodotus. According to this version, the Etruscans migrated from the eastern Mediterranean. Herodotus referred to the Etruscans as Tyrrhenians or Tyrsenians. To this day, the part of the Mediterranean Sea between the Apennine Peninsula and the islands of Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica is named the Tyrrhenian Sea because for several centuries the Etruscans dominated this region, as well as most of the Apennine Peninsula. This was before even Rome claimed supremacy in Italy. Therefore, it is not surprising that Greek and Roman historians wrote a lot about the Etruscans. The second theory of the origin of the Etruscans belongs to Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who challenged Herodotus' version. In his work Roman Antiquities, Dionysius claimed that the Etruscans were not settlers but the indigenous and oldest people of Italy. distinct from all their neighbors on the Apennine Peninsula in terms of language and customs. In the mid-18th century, a third version emerged, known as the Northern Theory of the origin of the Etruscans. It was proposed by the French historian Nicolas Frère. According to his opinion, the Etruscans, along with other Italian tribes, entered the territory of Italy through the Alpine passes. This version had no support in ancient tradition and lacked any material evidence. However, in the 19th century, it was considered almost the sole key to the mystery of Etruscan origins. This theory was particularly popular among German historians.
There are many perspectives that have been subjected to modern criticism. Today, the problem lies in the fact that archaeology cannot favor any particular theory. Thus, various assumptions remain open. One modern theory from the 1990s belongs to the renowned Etruscologist Massimo Palatino. It suggests that the Etruscan civilization, as we know it, originated in Italy. This is true. However, this theory did not solve the problem of the Etruscan origins. Was this people who had their own language of Italian origin, or did they come from somewhere in prehistoric times? My personal opinion is that we should not underestimate the opinion of such a significant historian as Herodotus, who in the 5th century BC recognized the eastern origin of the Etruscans from Turkey.
But in the mid-19th century, Russian archaeologist and Slavic historian Alexander Dmitrievich Chertkov proposed his theory of the origin of the Etruscans. He traveled across Europe for many years, living in Austria, Switzerland, and Italy. In studying the ancient history of the Etruscans, he concluded that they were Slavs. The scholarly world received Chertov's research with indifferent skepticism, and his books were soon forgotten. Historians could not accept the idea that Russians lived in Italy even before the emergence of Rome and founded the ancient Etruscan culture. Because in the Scaligerian concept of history, this seemed senseless. Independent of Chertkov, the Slavic version of the Etruscan origin was proposed by Polish archaeologist and collector Tadeusz Wielański. In the 20th century, the theories of Chertkov and Wielański found confirmation in the research of Russian scholars Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky.
The history of the Etruscans remains highly intriguing and continues to attract a lot of interest, both in the West and in our own country. However, all these studies are heading in a strange and seemingly dead-end direction. It is commonly assumed that the Etruscans were an entirely separate civilization that could not have had any connection to the Slavs. Therefore, when the works of Chompy, Chertkov, and Wielański emerged in the 19th century, providing evidence that Etruscan inscriptions were written in the Slavic language, at least many of them, these works were not acknowledged. They were not refuted, no errors were found in them. They simply went unnoticed. And even now, more than 100 years later, they have not been recognized by the world of Etruscology. It is only in the light of the new chronology that these works are seen in a completely different way. It becomes clear that Chompy, Valansky, and Chertkov made truly significant discoveries, and their findings should attract the attention of scholars.
Indeed, Etruscologists unjustifiably ignore the research of Valansky and Chertkov. Their works help solve another mystery that scientists have been unable to unravel: the language of the Etruscans. In the Renaissance epoch, all the lettering found in Italy that differed from Latin graphically was presumed Etruscan. Currently, there are over 12,000 known Etruscan inscriptions. However, very few of them contain more than 20 words. All kinds of alphabets were employed to decipher these texts: Hebrew, Arabic, Anglo-Saxon, Runic, and even Chinese. But all efforts were in vain. Hence the saying, Etruscan is not readable. In 1825, the Italian scholar Sebastiano Ciampi proposed using the Slavic alphabet to decipher Etruscan inscriptions. The reason was that he had been a professor at the University of Warsaw for several years. After learning some Polish, the Italian scholar was astonished to find that he could read and even understand some Etruscan inscriptions. Upon his return to Italy, Ciampi eagerly shared his discovery with his colleagues. However, they sternly pointed out to him that the Germans, as the most authoritative scholars in Europe, had long proven that the Slavs did not appear on the historical stage before the 6th century AD, or even later. Consequently, in Italy, no one paid due attention to Ciampi's words. Failing to garner attention for his call to explore the Slavic interpretation of Etruscan inscriptions, the scholar became disheartened.
The problems related to the study of the Etruscan language have absolutely nothing to do with the alphabet. The Etruscan alphabet is very clear. It is the Greek alphabet imported from Cumae, a part of Greece. The Etruscan alphabet, just like the Latin script, is a transformation of the Greek alphabet. Therefore, the Etruscan alphabet is easily readable. We can read it perfectly fine. The problem lies in the language. Let me give you a modern example. I can read Polish text perfectly well. It is written in Latin letters. However, I won't understand anything because it's the Slavic language. The same applies here. We can easily read Etruscan texts but don't understand them because we don't know their language.
Tadeusz Valansky and Alexander Chertkov were more consistent in their studies of Etruscan texts, as Slavic languages were their native tongues. Valansky achieved the most interesting results in deciphering Etruscan inscriptions. For convenience of deciphering, he compiled a special table that allowed him to successfully translate many Etruscan texts. Here's what the table looks like. The first column shows the Etruscan alphabet. The second column shows Cyrillic. The third column shows the Polish alphabet, and the fourth column shows the Bohemian alphabet. Complex letters that represent a combination of several letters are displayed at the bottom left of the table. By the way, Cyrillic also has complex letters like
Я, Ю, Кси, Пси.
and others. Notice that the Cyrillic letters and Etruscan letters are more or less similar. For example, letter
Глаголь, есть, зело, како, люди, мыслите, наш, покой, твердо, ут, ша, ять.
The authors of the New Chronology, Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nisovsky, believe that this table allows us to visually see the closeness between the Etruscan language and the Slavic languages. But how does one, using this table, read a specific text?
Valansky approached the decipherment of Etruscan texts quite simply. He took an Etruscan text, then used a table created by Valansky. This is a very non-trivial, very important discovery of his. In this text, the letters are replaced with Cyrillic according to his table. A Cyrillic text is obtained. After that, it is necessary to determine in which direction it is written, right to left or left to right. In the past, different peoples wrote in both ways. After that, it is necessary to understand how the text is divided into words and try to read it in Russian, in Slavic. As our experience and Valansky's experience show, usually after this rather simple operation, the meaning of the text becomes clear.
Obviously, like any old Russian text, the Etruscan text will have to be read several times, delving into its meaning. The thing is that in old texts there are no spaces between words. This greatly complicates reading, but nevertheless, with some effort, it can be read. According to Valansky, it turns out that the difficulty of reading the Etruscan text is not much higher than reading many old Russian texts, which also contain individual unfamiliar words. However, most Etruscan words are still understandable. This can be confirmed by reading several translations of Etruscan inscriptions made by Valansky. From Theodor Mommsen's essay The Lower Italian Dialects, Valansky learned about a funerary monument found in 1846 near the Italian town of Creccio. Since 1852, this archaeological monument has been preserved in the National Museum in Naples. Interestingly, in his book, Mommsen wrote that even an attempt to interpret this inscription would be a very bold one indeed. Valansky attempted to translate this text, and here is what he came up with. All Father from Paradise, above Vim and Dim, you are the Yezman of Russia. Take care of my home and my children, greatest Yezman. Hecate's domain is far away. I set forth to the end of the earth. And, verily, this is so, just like Aeneas was my forefather. Together with Lad in Elysium, you shall drink from the Lethe and forget. Oh, dear one, kind one.
Certainly, it cannot be said that in Valansky's translation the meaning of the Etruscan text became fully understandable. That is not the case. However, it is absolutely evident that there are numerous understandable Russian words and entire phrases in it, which collectively make up Russian expressions, comprising more than half of the text. That's a lot. It should be noted that when reading old Etruscan texts, Valansky was convinced that they were written long before Christ, and therefore, there could be nothing Christian in them. However, according to the New Chronology, these texts are already Christian, written after Christ. Therefore, they may well contain familiar Christian expressions known to us from church books. This makes the text more comprehensible because, in reality, they are indeed Christian texts.
And indeed, If one is not afraid to see Christian phrases in this inscription, here is what emerges. And thus said the great Lord to my Yezmin in Russia. He is also the guardian of my home and children. Fair Yezmin. Yucatan is far away. Only faith. The faith of Tsar Aeneas sitting with Lad and Elijah. Do you remember, or do you forget? Oh, dear one, kind one. We see a fully meaningful Old Russian text, although unknown names are mentioned. Maidim, Yezmin. Presumably, these are old names of some localities in Italy. The name Russia is mentioned directly in the standard form used by Southern Slavs, Russia. Unfortunately, this Etruscan text cannot be read in its entirety. However, not all Old Russian texts are read completely to the last word today. But if entire lines and phrases are clearly readable in the Etruscan text, it can be concluded that the language for decoding was chosen correctly. And that language is Russian. This figurine of a boy with a goose in his hands was found in 1746 in the Tuscan estates. Jansen published it in his collection of Etruscan inscriptions. At the time, this figurine was talked about a lot and for a very long time, for 100 years, but no one provided an explanation for the inscription made on this figurine. Here is the translation. The wind caught up with the white goose, surrendered itself willingly to Alpin. Behold! Geta went there naked, just hoping. And this is a bronze figurine of a boy with a bird, found in 1587. The figurine itself and the inscription made on the boy's leg have been repeatedly depicted. However, this text still cannot be explained. In the original, the text sounds as follows.
Воля дає, може, що за ній мілікчает.
And here is the translation. I'm giving leave. Maybe the dear one awaits something. This two-sided cameo was depicted on the title page of Ulrich Friedrich Kopp's book published in 1827. On one side of the cameo, there is an image of the nymph Menethia and Cupid flying towards her. However, the book did not mention anything about the inscription made on this cameo. In Etruscan,
Стрела Купида ранит Менефеи.
In translation it means, Cupid's arrow wounds Menethia. On the second side of the cameo, there is an inscription consisting of 7 lines.
Яо Саваоф Адоней. Ей, коли яга лается, идут в Тартарою скотину.
Translation: I, Shabwoth Adonai. Yea! Those who speak ill of him roll to Tartarus, the swine. It is astonishing why for so many years Etruscologists couldn't decipher this inscription. After all, it is written in ordinary Slavic letters, from left to right.
We believe that it was a deliberate choice. The thing is, that during the Reformation era in Western Europe, evidence of the fact that the conquests of the 14th–15th centuries were Slavic, Russo-Turkish, including the Ottoman conquest of the 15th century, were being erased. In essence, an unofficial ban was imposed on reading old texts using Slavic languages. Furthermore, it was de facto forbidden to use Slavic languages to decipher allegedly unreadable inscriptions, including Etruscan ones.
Relying specifically on Slavic languages, Tadeusz Wilański successfully deciphered not only Etruscan texts but also many other inscriptions found in Western Europe. These inscriptions, like the Etruscan ones, were considered unreadable. However, in Wilański's opinion, they can be deciphered as Slavic. Nevertheless, Valansky was well aware that his discovery would not be well received in Western Europe, and therefore, in a letter to the archaeologist Karol Rogovsky, he wrote, "Are there no Slavic monuments in Italy, India, Persia, and even in Egypt? Do not the ancient books of Zoroaster, the ruins of Babylon, the monuments of Darius, the remnants of Persepolis covered in cuneiform script, contain inscriptions understandable to Slavs?" The English, French, and Germans look at this without getting a clue. It can be said that Valansky's research on the history of Slavs in Western Europe was a great scientific feat. Therefore, the life of the scholar was not easy. In 1853, the Catholic Church included Valansky's books in the Index of Forbidden Books, and Polish Jesuits burned his books on a pyre. But they found it insufficient and demanded the execution of the scholar. It was only thanks to the intervention of Emperor Nicholas I that Valansky remained alive. It is believed that the Etruscans were pagans. Historians compare Etruscan gods with the gods of the Roman pantheon.
Etruscan religion is polytheistic, like most beliefs in the ancient world of Italy and Greece. It shares many similarities with other religions of ancient Italy. Etruscan religion was heavily influenced by Greek religion. Many Greek deities found their way into Etruscan religion, and likewise, many Etruscan gods were discovered in Greek religion. Thus, it was an assimilation process.
But here's something interesting. The holy book of the Etruscans turns out to have been known as Suda, which is Book of Judgment, or Book of the Law. After all, the concept of law and judgment are closely related. It turns out that the Etruscans were familiar with the Russian word sud, which stands for law and judgment. Parts of this book have survived to this day in descriptions of Roman authors. Scholars have long ago noticed the similarities between the Etruscan holy book of Suda and the first chapters of Genesis. Researchers invested a lot of effort into the explanation of the similarities between the text of the Suda and the Bible. However, since traditional historical accounts suggest that Etruscan and biblical authors lived in different eras, the task for historians from the Scaligerian school has been exceptionally challenging. They have been unable to solve it to this day. However, the authors of the new chronology have found the answer to this question.
According to the new chronology, the Etruscan conquerors, or rather colonizers of Western Europe of the 14th century, were Christians, and obviously used the Christian holy books, in particular, the books of the Christian law. For example, the book Kormchi, which they could have called the Book of Judgment because it pertains to the law and Christian Orthodox judgment. We only know the Etruscan book, Suda, through retellings by Roman, ancient, and Greek authors, or more precisely, as we now understand, by later editors. Unfortunately, we don't have the exact text. And it is not surprising at all that even from these retellings, it is evident that it parallels the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible.
Marionis, a Franciscan monk from Florence, links the ancient past of Etruria with the myths of the Genesis in his tractate entitled, On the Progeny, Nobility and Glory of Tuscia. According to his opinion, the sons of Noah populated the world after the deluge, and one of them, named Homer, decided to settle in Etruria. His descendants were the first to embrace the teaching of Christ. Alexander Nemirovsky, a Russian researcher of ancient Roman history and Etruscan culture, wrote in his book, Etruscans, From Myth to History, that in the search for information about the Tyrrhenians, that is, the Etruscans, the Bible cannot be excluded. It contains numerous references to the peoples of the ancient Near East, the Black Sea region, and the Mediterranean. Indeed, in the chapter 10 of the book of Genesis, it is stated, "And the sons of Javan, Elisha and Tarshish, Kittim and Dodanim. By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, every one after his tongue, after their families, in their nations." It has long been suggested that Tarshish corresponds to the semi-legendary city of Tartessos, and historians themselves associate this city with the Etruscans.
The well-known biblical name Tarshish could refer to Turks, Tatars, or Russians. It turns out that the compilers of the Bible were familiar with the Etruscans under the name Tarshish. By the way, it is understandable why in the Bible, the people of Tarshish are referred to as the sons of Javan, which corresponds to Ivan. According to our results based on the new chronology, this was the great Mongol conquest of the 14th century which was led by Tsar Khan Ivan Khalida. Thus, the Bible truly did reflect the events of the 14th century AD well.
It is known that in the late 15th century, a series of tractates on the Etruscans appeared in the capital of Tuscany, Florence, written by natives of Tuscany who were representatives of the Catholic Church. One of them, Cardinal Egidio da Viterbo, described Etruria not only as the hearth of the most ancient culture in Italy but also as the eternal protector and benefactor of religions. The cardinal saw no difference between the pagan Etruria and the Christian Tuscany of his time. The appearance of these tractates indicates that even in the late 15th century, the true history of the Etruscans was well remembered in Tuscany. However, modern historians, despite their knowledge of the Book of Judgment, biblical texts, and medieval writings, continue to write dissertations about the pagan beliefs of the Etruscans and their pre-Christian existence. The history of the conflict between Tuscany, that is, Etruria, and Rome, speaks to the extent of the Etruscan influence in Europe. In the Middle Ages, Tuscany was one of the most powerful republics and for a long time contested Rome for supremacy in Italy. In 1619, Scottish scholar Thomas Dempster wrote an extensive work titled 7 Books About Royal Etruria, based on the testimonies of ancient authors. In his work, Dempster wrote that the Etruscans introduced laws in Italy and were the first philosophers, geometers, priests, city builders, temple builders, inventors of war machines, physicians, artists, sculptors, and agronomists. It seems that Dempster did not even question that if the Etruscans had invented everything in the fields of technology and culture, what remains for the Greeks and Romans? However, the work of Dempster, written in the early 17th century, was published only 100 years later, in 1723. The publication of this book marked a new wave of interest in the Etruscans because at that time Austria ruled over the territory of Tuscany. The people of Tuscany considered the Etruscans their ancestors, so the study of their glorious history appealed to their sense of patriotism. So, why wasn't the Dempster's book published in the 17th century but only 100 years later?
In the 17th century, in Rome and in general in Western Europe, a deliberate false version of world history was being written. This version omitted the Etruscans since all human achievements were attributed to the ancient Greeks and Romans. The Etruscans were a nuisance and got in the way, so they were pushed far into the past, even earlier than the 8th century BC, before the foundation of Rome. What happened as a result? It turned out that the history of the Russian conquerors of Western Europe in the 14th century, the Etruscans, was relegated to a distant and unreadable past, thus erasing the traces of Russian presence in Western Europe.
However, Tuscany continued to fight for its version of history, in which the real Etruscans played the leading role, not mythical ancient Italian Romans and ancient Greeks. The Vatican, in turn, sought to establish its erroneous concept of the so-called ancient Rome and ancient Greece. Interests clashed, and Tuscany lost. Consequently, Dempster's work fell under the Roman ban. Only when Austrians entered Tuscany did the delighted Florentines temporarily escape Roman control and attempted to seek revenge. They hastily published Dempster's book, but it was already too late. The false history of supposed ancient Italian Rome had firmly established itself in the pages of historical books. As a result, the Tuscans were simply ridiculed. Nevertheless, they continued to assert their correctness. In 1726, the Etruscan Academy was established in the city of Cortona. Its members consisted of noble gentlemen from many cities in Tuscany. The Academy's report stated that not only in Italy but also in Spain and Anatolia, almost all traces of artistic activity belonged to the Etruscans. In Cortona, the Museum of the Etruscan Academy was created. Followers of Scaliger long fought against the defiant Florentines who steadfastly stood their ground. It was only in the 19th century that their resistance was finally broken. The historical version of Rome eventually emerged victorious. Although, the fact remained a fact. Rome became Rome thanks to the Etruscans and entered history as one of the Etruscan cities. Once upon a time, the Etruscans wanted to make that city the stronghold of their dominance in Latium. But at that time, they naturally could not foresee that Rome, to which they helped emerge onto the historical stage, would destroy their dominant position in Italy. Furthermore, they did not anticipate that Rome would distort the facts of the Etruscans' past greatness. The Romans had a weakness for legends and myths. They indulged themselves in legends where truth was mixed with half-truths and often outright fabrications. For instance, the Romans insisted that the progenitor of the Roman people was the Trojan hero Aeneas, who ended up on the shores of Italy after the fall of Troy. But no matter how much the Romans opposed the Tuscans, they even borrowed the legend of Aeneas from the Etruscans. Thus, the myth of the glorious origin of Rome emerged, claiming that from the very beginning, it stood above all its neighbors. Over time, this myth was recognized as historical reality and found its way into historical works. Historians began borrowing it from one another.
The Etruscans were an important people, particularly during the Archaic era, even before Rome transformed into a powerful state. Moreover, they exerted influence on Rome. In the early stages of its history, Rome had 3 Etruscan kings. The Etruscans made significant contributions to the formation of Italian civilization in antiquity, culturally, historically, and religiously. Today, I believe it is an acknowledged fact. Etruscan history is studied and recognized for its importance, just like the history of other peoples.
The history of the Etruscans is only a part of the Slavic history of Western Europe. For several centuries, historians of the Scaliger school tirelessly worked to eradicate from the memory of peoples the facts of Slavic settlement in Europe. They denied the presence of Slavs in different lands and countries for so long and persistently that it resulted in an utterly absurd historical narrative. It appears that Slavs did not exist in ancient times at all. Where they came from is entirely unclear. By distorting the true past of the Slavs, Scaligerian historians rendered them homeless and landless. According to their theory, no ancient European region can have a Slavic name. And in the languages of Europe and Asia, these so-called scholars search for any roots except Slavic ones. However, many scholars saw nothing strange in the fact that traces of Slavic population were constantly discovered in many European lands. One of them was the distinguished Russian scholar Vasily Markovich Florinsky. In the 19th century, he was engaged in comparative archaeology. Florinsky sought to answer the question of which people the thousands of ancient burial mounds found in Siberia belonged to. Florinsky's answer to this question was clear and unambiguous. The burial mounds were constructed by the ancient population of Siberia, belonging to the Aryan race, which later became known as the Slavs. Florinsky conducted extensive research, comparing findings from the settlement that Schliemann declared to be ancient Troy, objects belonging to the Adriatic and Baltic Veneti, with findings from the burial mounds of northern and southern Russia. The similarity of the discovered household items, ornaments, and pottery was so striking that there was no doubt. They were made by representatives of the same people, that is, the Slavs. It turns out that Asia Minor and a significant part of Western Europe in the past were populated by the same Slavic people as Russia and Siberia. Florinsky wrote that the Veneti were Adriatic or Italian Slavs, that they were part of the alliance of Trojan tribes that left Troy. The Veneti founded Venice and Padua. Interestingly, Venice stands on ancient wooden piles that are several hundred years old. It is believed that these piles were made of Siberian larch. The question arises, how are the builders of Venice connected to Siberia? Some scholars try to explain the wide distribution of similar Slavic objects throughout the Eurasian territory, but they do so within the framework of the erroneous Scaligerian chronology. Instead of placing all this vast Slavic material in the Middle Ages, they push it into the distant past, inventing theories about some ancient Proto-Slavs. Another Russian scholar, Alexei Homiakov, wrote about the Veneti or Vens. In his works, he lists dozens of examples of traces of the Vens found in Western Europe. This includes the Austrian city of Vienna and the French province of Vendée. Lake Constance was formerly called the Lacus Venetis. Homyakov wrote, "In the land of Vens rivers and cities bear the names of Sebra, Sevra, Sava. 15 towns and villages bear the name Bellegarde, which is not found elsewhere in France and which is translated as Alba. As you know, Alba means white, and Bellegarde is simply a white town." Homyakov also wonders how many different peoples historians arbitrarily attributed not to the Slavic root, but to the Germanic one, as if the Veneti did not exist in Europe. Although the Veneti inhabited the shores of the Adriatic and Baltic seas since ancient times and sailed the stormy waters of the Atlantic, and they were not scattered tribes but a numerous people who inhabited half of Europe. Alexander Dmitrievich Chertkov wrote that more than 25 books published in Germany between 1575 and 1842 report that Slavs have lived in German lands. Slavs were the builders of Leipzig, Delitzsch, Rauhlitz and Dresden. However, all these numerous books were suppressed by Scaligerian historians. They clearly contradicted the official history. But Slavic roots in Europe are so deep that historians and archaeologists constantly encounter them.
Slavs have been living in Germany since ancient times.
For example, the Lusatian Serbs. And the Lusatian language is one of the West Slavic languages, spoken among the Lusatian Serbs, also known as Lusatians or Sorbs. The number of speakers of this language is 60,000 people, with 40,000 living in Saxony and 20,000 in Brandenburg. A new understanding of Etruscan history is also a new perspective on the ancient Russian history of the 14th to 16th centuries. Since the 17th century, we have been consistently indoctrinated with the belief that compared to European culture, Russian culture has always been at a very low level, and all the discoveries and achievements of the ancient world belong to the great European civilizations. However, the true history of the Etruscans tells the opposite. Slavs were the basis for the development and prosperity of European states, while the tribes inhabiting Europe for several centuries benefited from the scientific, cultural, and military heritage of Slavic peoples without any gratitude. Today, modern historians have the opportunity to reconstruct the true history of the Etruscans. They do not have to start from scratch. Their predecessors did tremendous work in the 19th century. But, as Volansky wrote even then, we Slavs will be able to bring these studies to completion only if our children and grandchildren choose to follow in our footsteps. Not only the history of the Etruscans but also the past of ancient Rome itself is not as well studied as it is commonly believed. Modern research indicates that the thick volumes dedicated to Roman civilization are merely rewriting the same legends invented by 16th-century historians. The authentic history of the peoples inhabiting the Italian peninsula looks completely different. So, what is ancient Roman history? Is it genuine history or literary myth? We will try to unravel this in our next film, Symbols of Ancient Rome.